Dr. Gordon returns today for a second history lecture at the library, The Story of the California Missions. Dr. Gordon is an internationally known historian, speaker, researcher, and author of 18 books, soon to be 19 books. He taught history at DePaul University, Chicago, and has presented historical programs across America to community groups, trade associations at colleges, universities, foundations, and museums. He has appeared on CBS's The Early Show, on CNN and PBS NewsHour, as well as National Public Radio. Dr. Gordon earned his BA and MA degrees in history at DePaul University in Chicago and a PhD at Loyola University in Chicago. Please join me in a nice warm Rancho Mirage Public Library welcome for Dr. Gordon.
Well, good afternoon. I'm happy to see you're all out here and not playing golf today. Today we're going to talk about a very interesting story of the California missions and the Native Americans of California, because their histories in many ways were intertwined from that point on. You know, there are 21 missions that stretch over 680 miles in the state. How many of you have visited any of the missions? Raise your hands. Now, how many of you have visited all 21 missions? Yes, my wife and I, over many trips, because it'd be hard to do in one trip. But you know, the Desert Sun just had an article. Maybe some of you saw it. Was Junipero a saint or a sinner? What is the real record? What's the real story behind the missions? Were they paradise on earth, or were they hell on earth for the Indians, enslaved by the priests? Well, today, as a professional historian, I hope to give you a balanced view so you have the whole story from top to bottom. This is a picture of, in 1769, when Portola sailed into San Diego Bay to start the California mission system with Father Serra. However, this is not the first time that the Spanish had been here. In 1542, Juan Cabrillo, who was Portuguese, had actually discovered California for Spain, and he too landed in San Diego. The difference was, after that, no one came here. I mean, think about that for a minute. The Spanish settled Mexico, the Caribbean, most of Central America and South America, but in 1769, there were very few, if any, Spaniards in California itself. What spurred them into action was Fort Ross. Russia controlled Alaska. Many of you have been to Alaska, maybe on cruises, and you visited Sitka, and you saw the Russian influence there. Of course, we bought Alaska. But the Californians were afraid that the Russians were going to attempt to claim California as part of their empire. The Russians were interested mainly, of course, in the fur trade, not in colonization. So when Portola landed, he was accompanied by Serra, Junipero Serra, who celebrated the first Mass, which you see here overlooking the bay. And his orders were to establish a mission train across up and down the entire coast of California. This is an early monument on the site where San Diego was actually founded. Serra then began to build the first mission, and of course that's in San Diego itself. Now that mission was moved. The site it's at now, near the ballpark, is not the original site. The first mission was destroyed. We'll talk about that a little later. He then went on to establish 9 of the 21 missions that we now have in the state. Now, as I said before, Spanish South America, of course, is a huge place. They were interested in 3 things: glory, God, and gold. Cortez, Pizarro, how many of you have been to Spain? And maybe you were in Cordoba or some of the other beautiful cathedrals. And you saw all that gold and silver behind the altars. And of course, the Indians generously donated all of that to the Spanish. Not really. So the Spanish came here, they conquered, and the difficulty, of course, was, unlike the settlement of English North America, where they sent the Puritans and other religious dissenters who weren't Anglicans, or they would send their penal, they would almost establish America as a penal colony and have indentured servants. The Spanish did not want anyone except real Spanish peasants to come and settle. And very few Spanish people really wanted to come to the New World. And this presented a very difficult problem. So the solution, in their mind, was to establish a mission system, and that's what they did. They used the missions up and down the coast of South America to acculturate Indians and to settle the territory and keep it in the power of the Spanish Empire. Now, in the southern regions, small bands of missionaries across North America fanned out across Florida, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. In fact, the first and oldest church in North America was not here, but in St. Augustine, Florida, 1565. In Texas, many of you have been to the Alamo, 1718. And many other missions are in San Antonio. If you ever go there, take the mission tour. It's very interesting. Santa Fe, New Mexico, Mission San Miguel, 1610. So as you can see from this, California was a real latecomer in this game. Now here's a map, though, of the missions in Alta California, Baja California. And that system of missions was established between 1683 and 1834 by a mixture of Jesuits, Franciscans, and Dominican missionaries. They actually established 27 missions beginning, but in California it was much later, and there are still missions down there today. In fact, here is the mission church in Loreto. Alta California missions were built along the Royal Road, the El Camino Real, the Old Kings Highway, between San Diego and Sonoma in the north. Today, they are all located all around or near Highway 101. And they were built near the coast because of supply. There were no roads, and it was easier to supply them by sea. Supposedly, the missions were one day's trip from one another. Well, you had to walk mighty fast and be in really great shape to do it, but I don't recommend it. I think you should drive it if you're going to do it. And the missions were established, as you can see, over many, many years, from San Diego to La Purísima, and the last one, Salerno, in 1823. So it took many, many years for them. Serra was born in Spain in 1713, and he began working in the California missions and was the president of the California missions between 1769 and 84 and set up 9 missions. Now, you have to also realize that there was a Spanish governor, and it was never quite clear where Serra's authority began and the governor's authority also began. There was tremendous conflict between the civil authority and the church in the running of the missions and the running of Spanish California. Father Lawson was with Serra, his assistant, and he was president of the missions from 1785 to 1803. He has helped establish 9 of the California missions. Carmel was Serra's headquarters and also for Larson, and if you have been to Carmel, you will see that he is buried there. So now, when we visit today's California missions, there are certain features that, of course, everyone recognizes. So let's take a look at it. This mission church is a mixture of both European and Native American religious art and statues. And though the architecture is basically a one-aisle church, a few missions like Santa Barbara are larger and have more aisles. The bell tower, the bells themselves are arranged. Some missions have more than one tower. Santa Barbara has two. The long corridor surrounding the inner courtyard, the beautiful mission gardens, and then many different ornamental openings. And then finally, of course, is the mission cemetery, filled with, as you'll probably notice, the bodies of a few priests, but mainly Native Americans from California. The classic design and signature of this mission was determined largely by the raw materials that were available to the Padres in building it. They did have some Spanish craftsmen who did travel from mission to mission to help build them and also teach the Indians carpentry, bricklaying, and other trades. 200 years later, the missions now stand as a great influence on California architecture. Those of you that have traveled the state have seen this popping up all over. The low silhouettes result of the limitations of adobe, of course. Walls 5 feet thick. Of course, we all know when it's 115 degrees, that's a great insulator. And the huge expanse awnings were designed to prevent the adobe walls from dissolving in the rain itself. With the Presidio, or fort, and the Pueblo, or town, the mission was one of the three most important agencies used by the Spanish to basically colonize their territories. In California, the mission systems were by far the most important single agency, far outweighing the other two for many, many years. The mission was much more, though, than just an adobe chapel and workshops. People mistakenly assumed that that's the whole mission. Wrong. It was really a colonial institution. This can best be seen at La Purísima, near Solvang, California. Now, 19 of the 21 California missions are active Catholic churches. They're local parish churches. 2 of them are museums, in Sonoma and La Purísima. The missions that you stroll through today have very little evidence of what it was really like to be in a mission in California during Serra's time. Fully restored missions like La Purísima give you an idea of the momentous activity that went there and why it was so busy, and the exhibits, and what actually was going on. As I mentioned earlier, the Spaniards lacked Spanish colonists. So to colonize this, they decided they would not only convert the Native Americans, but they also would acculturate the Native Americans over a period of 50 to 100 years and turn them into Spanish peasants. To bring this to an end, they had various religious orders that came here, and to a certain extent, this did work, because when you think of it, the dominant language of South America besides Portuguese, and there were also Portuguese missions, not run by the Franciscans, but by the Jesuits. Spanish is the dominant language besides Native American dialects throughout South and Central America. And this is because of the mission systems. As soon as work was finished in building this mission, the priests legally were obliged to start teaching the Native Americans crafts to help them become farmers, wheelwrights, carpenters, as you'll see in a moment. And ultimately, the idea was within 50 to 100 years, the mission land itself would be turned over to the Native Americans. And they, in turn, would become the local Spanish population. They'd be acculturated. This did work to varying degrees in Central and South America. Here, however, in California, it was too soon. It was 65 years. It was too quick. Some of the Native American groups in Central and South America also had much more sophisticated cultures when the Spanish arrived. They acculturated faster. It was more successful there. Here, the process had only just started, as we'll see, when the Mexican government, after the Mexican Revolution, started turning the land over to the rancheros. So in addition to conversion to Christianity, the two basic missions then were to teach the Native Americans to read and write Spanish, if possible, and to help them learn a trade. There were 6 different languages spoken by Native American Californians between San Diego and Sonoma, and a babble of local dialects. Those who joined at the age of 30 probably would never learn another language. So a good number, though, of the younger children did learn Spanish. One padre wrote, "In the boys born at the mission and of better instruction, there is noticed much inclination to read and write in Spanish. But for reading and writing in his own idiom, little or no inclination has been observed. But we doubt not that such facility that would acquit them in the one as in the other language, were there no paper, pen lacking." So instead of using books, you see what they did. They used them teaching them music. You've seen in some of the mission museums these large hymnals where the Native American children would learn to sing in Latin or Spanish. The vocabularies of the Native Americans contain very few words for things that could not be seen or heard or touched or tasted. The padre used Spanish to teach the Native Americans, a decision that had far-reaching effects, as I said, ultimately on the tongue of what people in Central and South America would speak. Now we come to a very remarkable story. My wife Elaine and I wrote this book, Literacy in America. This talks about how Americans became literate before 1900. There's an entire chapter in here on Native American literacy. In the English colonies, in New France, and certainly at the missions of Spain, there was an effort to teach at least some of the children to speak. There is a document called The Conversion of Luzano Tac. It was written in 1835 by a Native American, Pablo Tac, who was residing then in Rome. Pablo Tac was born in a California mission in San Luis Rey in 1822. He died in Rome in 1841. He wrote a commentary, the only one in existence, of what it was like to live at a California mission, the only one written by a Native American. He was one of 6 children. He was baptized shortly after birth. He was a good student. By the age of 10, he showed a capacity for advanced work. He and another boy were taken to the Franciscan College in Mexico City. He apparently decided to then send these 2 boys to Rome, the bishop there, and from 1832 to 34, Pablo Tac resided. First, he went to Spain, and then he was in New York and France. By 1834, he had arrived in Rome, where he was enrolled at an urban college. It obviously was an overwhelming culture shock for both of these boys. They began a 4-year study in Latin. Unfortunately, one of the boys fell ill and died in 1837. Pablo completed his course in 1838. He went on to study rhetoric, humanities, philosophy. In 1839, he took his vows as a priest in the Catholic Church. Tac worked on a grammatical sketch of his native tongue with a dictionary with about 1,200 words. He was unable to finish his book because he too died in 1841. And what did these Native Americans die of? They died of simple Western diseases. They had absolutely no tolerance built up for our diseases. So many died in the missions, and also many Native Americans died in New England, in New France, wherever they came in contact with measles, chicken pox, or whatever. These were not orchestrated epidemics to decimate the Native American populations. They simply had no resistance to this bacteria. The conversion of Pablo Tac was completed at an earlier date. And he wrote what was done each day. And the interesting thing is, he wrote this book basically when he was 12 or 13 years of age, which is truly amazing. Much of what Tock wrote has been confirmed by other eyewitness accounts at other California missions. Several priests tell us the little boys of the mission in a few months learn everything. They read in Spanish or Latin. They learn to read from manuscripts, to sing the plain or in figured music. Well, what did the mission look like? When North Americans, of course, most of them did not respond to learning the Spanish language or Latin. They were directed instead, in fact, that's one of the lectionaries he learned from. There we go. What did the mission look like? Well, take a look at this, and you will see that it was, in many ways, a large vocational training school. The largest schools sometime enrolled more than 2,000 Indians learning tanning, blacksmithing, winemaking, stock tending, and the care of crops. Women learned to cook, sew, spin, and weave. Others were millwrights, carpenters. Now, at La Purísima today, you can see these facilities if you visit. Santa Barbara, the queen of the missions, also will show you its vocational site and what it did to teach Native Americans these trades in things such as carpentry, blacksmith, agriculture, wine production, a flour mill, and making tallow for candles, which was very important. As the Native American population increased, it became necessary to remove the flocks and herds from the immediate vicinity of these 21 missions, where the land was mainly used for fruits and vegetables. The first of the mission ranches opened in 1774, where the friars from San Diego established a corral for mares and horses at a nearby Rancho San Luis. Another was established in San Bernardino, not that far from here. The priests did come out to this area, and they considered it too arid, and they didn't see how they could irrigate, so nothing was established right here in this valley. Now, there were also assistant missions, Ascensias, and one of these is San Isabel. Let's just go back. There's San Isabel. These were set up as branches, and several of these still exist on Native American reservations right around this valley. So you can go and visit San Isabel. In their heyday, the California missions comprised the sole industrial plant of Alta California. They conducted a flourishing commerce with trading vessels from the East Coast and from foreign countries. They traded hide, tallow, grain, wine, leatherwork, and the Padres were able to acquire tools, furniture, tobacco, nails, hardware, etc. By 1834, on the eve of the seizure of the missions by the Mexican government, the California Native Americans at the 21 missions had a herd of 396,000 cattle, 62,000 horses, and 321,000 hogs, sheep, and goats. And the Native Americans were harvesting 123,000 bushels of grain. Not too shabby. It is amazing to consider that 65 years earlier, there was not a single horse, cow, sheep, goat, or bushel of wheat in the whole of California. Although some of the missions amassed considerable wealth, thanks to the skillful administration and the hard work of the Native Americans, none of these profits were given to the Padres, who had taken vows of poverty. Instead, they were reinvested in the missions and in the Native Americans who lived there. Now, from a historical, accurate perspective, it is very important not to paint an idealistic nirvana picture of Native American life at the California missions. Not so. Once an Indian agreed to live in the mission community and to be trained as a convert to Catholicism, he could no longer take his family and leave without permission. Indians were subjected to rigid authoritarian discipline. Some were beaten. Besides learning the externals of the Catholic faith, they were expected to attend worship services several times a day. Everyone went to school to learn a basic trade, and as I said, some of them obviously became literate. Also, each mission was self-sufficient in itself. Now, on the other hand, for Native Americans in California, they were very well fed 3 times a day. This was a hunter-gatherer culture in this state. This was a very powerful reason to convert for many of them. That was their initial reason for many. And it freed them from this perpetual search for food that dominated many Native American lives in the pre-mission days. The Spanish also observed almost every saint day, every holiday, celebrations, processions, games, and fiestas, which meant that that's when they did no work. Also, many of the padres at missions would allow the Native Americans 2-week vacations every 5 weeks to their local native villages. So there was variation from mission to mission on how strict and how rigid the padre was in running the mission. Though the majority of Native Americans seemed to be content with this new way of life, there was a large minority that did not adjust well to this regimentation and suppression of their prior freedom and customs. Runaway neophytes, these were what the Native Americans were called, who were preparing to become baptized, were constantly being hunted down and punished. Nearly almost every mission, there were unconverted Native Americans who harassed the mission and encouraged escape and rebellion. In 12 instances, there were large-scale revolts resulting in the death of missionary priests and the destruction of the mission buildings. San Diego's original buildings were destroyed in such a revolt. Soldiers were often a problem at these missions. A corporal's guard of 5 to 6 soldiers were assigned to each mission. There were many incidents throughout the history of the missions of them raping Indian Native American women, including the wives of chiefs. Sarah and the governor of California were often literally at sword's point over who would control these men and stop these behaviors. So this was a problem at the missions, no 2 ways about it. Critics of the mission system charged that it was a thinly disguised form of slavery and that the friars failed to acculturate the Native Americans. Besides suppressing native cultures, the mission system introduces diseases that devastated the population that had no immunity against the white man's illnesses. This was true, of course, as I mentioned, across all of North America. Wherever whites had contacts with Native Americans, unfortunately, the immune systems of the Native Americans would at some point collapse, and there would be mass infestations of disease. When Lewis and Clark, on their famous expedition to the Pacific, stopped with the Mandans in what is now Mandan, North Dakota, and I've been there, they spent their winter with them. Not long afterwards, chickenpox ravaged the Mandans and destroyed almost all of them. Thousands of them died. Lewis and Clark didn't necessarily infect them with chickenpox, but someone else did. This was not something, again, done in an intentional way. Now, the Native Americans of California were basically very peace-loving Indians, peace-loving Native Americans, and lacked a strong warlike tradition. But they did resent the Spanish invasion and suppression of their way of life. But keep in mind, there were only 300 Spanish soldiers scattered over 650 miles to keep the missions functioning and protected. And there were about 100,000 Native Americans in California at that time. The devotion and skill, there were only 60 Franciscan missionaries that manned those missions at one time. And it's a tribute both to their success in teaching literacy and skilled trades to many of these Native Americans. 31,000 of them became Christians during that time period. In 1823, the last California mission, San Francisco Solano in Sonoma, was established. This was the culmination of 300 years of mission systems throughout all of the Spanish Americas. But the Alta California part of this vision of settlement was founded only during the dying years of the Spanish Empire. All of the abundance was too tempting a wealth for Mexican officials and the local landholders who had come from Mexico. The Mexican Revolution of 1810 to 1820 swept Spain out of this region and, of course, out of the Americas. And with it, the church's landholding trust to the local Indians. In 1833, the Mexican independence movement resulted in a decree that secularized all of the California missions. However, the Indians at 21, the Native Americans at 21 missions were not ready to take over their own affairs. Though the Franciscans had already settled some Native Americans on mission land. The resulting disintegration of the missions led to Native Americans being swindled out of their land holdings by the local Mexican ranchers. When the order finally came through, some of the missions were processed immediately. Some were secularized over the next 16 years. By 1846, 800 landowners called rancheros had seized over 8 million acres of prime mission land. They literally enslaved the Native Americans to work that land. This was no preparation for them to take over or learn a trade. When California became a territory of the United States, the Native Americans were virtually eradicated by disease. The U.S. government then moved them off their ancestral lands and herded the few survivors into reservations located on some of the most useless and desolate parts of the state. Of course, by a twist of fate, here in Palm Springs, that became some very valuable real estate, didn't it? It also was the same federal government that, in a belated gesture in the 19th century, and in an attempt to acculturate the Indians, they set up vocational training schools in the East to teach Native American children trades. Their difference was they removed them from their families and parents. One of the most famous schools was in Pennsylvania. Many of these young people would return after graduating. They would not be Indian, they would no longer be a Native American, nor they would be white, and they were ostracized. It didn't work. In time, most of the missions themselves fell into great disrepair. Without active parishes to keep them going, the old buildings fell prey to weather. Roofs collapsed, and many of the buildings were abandoned as unsafe and unsalvageable. The mission orchards, the herds, the fields, they were gone. They rapidly disintegrated. Many of the irrigation systems also fell apart. Only within a few years, there was little left to indicate the prosperity of the California mission systems. After California became an American territory and state, the property rights of the missions was reviewed by the Federal Land Commission. Basically, the Congress between 1830 and 1860 returned most of the mission land to the church. And in 1863, Abraham Lincoln returned the rest of it to the church. Most of the missions were given back the land that was only occupied, however, the original quadrangle, meaning basically the church and some of the outer buildings. These structures, of course, had long since collapsed. The church often found itself encumbered with buildings that basically no longer can serve a religious function. For many decades, the dissolution of the missions continued until public-spirited Californians began to take an interest in them and the purpose of restoration. Within the last few decades, restoration has been accompanied with scientific accuracy. Old records and drawings show what the missions looked like, and from this, the state of California, the federal government, private foundations, and the California Mission Foundation have helped to restore 21 of the original missions. Today, the mission influence runs from university campuses here at Santa Clara to office buildings and millions of residential houses in the Spanish style of architecture. The state of California draws 100 million tourists annually, and it will interest you to know that the largest number of tourists, even more than going to Disneyland, go to visit the California missions each year. With this in mind, it is no wonder that the missions draw so many travelers to their pleasant grounds, and it is also a very important historical site. So it is the present-day traveler can see and explore more missions that are accessible today than ever before. Although few of the original buildings are intact, practically all the churches and some of the quadrangles have been restored. In contrast to the situation of only a few years ago, today's travelers will find something worth seeing in every mission. Now let us take a virtual tour of a mission as if you wanted to do this from here. Well, we'll start, of course, at the Mission Inn in Riverside. Now, this was never a mission, folks. Sorry. It's a charming place to have lunch, particularly in their courtyard, and many are married in their chapel. Nearby, near Pasadena, is San Gabriel in 1771. The first Americans to reach California, Jeremiah Johnson, he went through the San Gorgonio Pass, right through here, to that mission. In 1826, Jedediah Smith also reached San Gabriel. Those were the first U.S. citizens. We have many Canadians here. We're all Americans, guys. All right. Established in 1797, one of the missions founded by Father Lawson is nearby. And at this mission in San Fernando are all of the mission archives and records. So if you want to do work on writing a book on the California missions, this is a great place to go. The Queen of the Missions, established in 1786 by Father Lawson, is Santa Barbara. And it's the only Californian mission with 2 matching bell towers. Others have 2 towers, but these are matching. Nearby is San Ynez, 1804, Father Tapas. It's near Solvang, California. And then near that is La Purísima, 1787 by Father Lawson. National Historic Site. It is the best and largest preserved historic park west of the Mississippi River. The outer buildings are there. They show exactly how the Indians lived, the vocational training, as well as the religious aspects of the mission. In 1782, Father Sierra also restored and is restored further in 1957 to the original architectural form of Santa Ventura. Now, how many of you would like to take such a tour of the California missions if it were offered from here? It'd take a few days to do it. Raise your hands. Let's see. Well, if you're interested, I'll flash up my email address. Email me, because potentially this library may offer such a trip, and maybe, if I'm available, I'll be the historian for it. And you can see many of this up close and personal. Over 180 years have come and gone since the passing of the California mission system. Each year, many Americans are becoming more impressed with the importance of preserving this historic monument and acknowledging the self-sacrifice of the friars and the hard work of the Native Americans who lived there. They faced great difficulties, enduring hardships, and in many instances, they lost their lives. In this brief review, we hope you see why the missions remain an important chapter in the historic development of California. Thank you very much.